Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Dr. Pak.
I'm Dr. Milo Wolf.
And today we have another great episode, this time on weak or tenuous muscle growth beliefs / ideas. This is the title that we're working with at the moment. It's not fully finalized, but essentially we're going to be talking about things that you often hear presented as game changers for muscle growth, when in reality they are weaker than they may appear. Things that make some intuitive sense, but when you look at their research more closely, there's still space for more research and for more questions to be answered. But before we jump right into the episode, it is the middle of August, one day before arguably the most important day in the world, my birthday. But more specifically, we are now at the stage of writing the infamous full ROM versus partials study. And in general, there are a few cool things coming out on the research front. Milo, do you want to touch on that?
Yeah. Should I speak about the results, or do we keep that under wraps for now?
I think we keep them under wraps, given that this will be out in a couple of weeks.
Even in a week, yeah, actually. Yeah, I mean, we've got some cool, interesting research coming out. I know Pak's been working on a case study on, hey, what happens when a bodybuilder takes steroids and bulks for 8 weeks? How much muscle growth do you observe? I've been running up the range of motion study that we described, looking at trained lifters, 8 weeks, lengthened partials versus full range of motion. Which one grows more muscle? Using one arm as the full range of motion training arm and the other arm as the lengthened partials arm. So all training for one arm / one side was performed with full range of motion. All training for the other side or other arm was performed with lengthened partials. And I think the results are pretty cool. And it's going to be, just a bit of a spoiler, it's going to be a bit of a Rorschach test wherein you can kind of take away from it what you want to. So yeah, very curious to see how people will react to the study, and I think Pak shares some of my excitement.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a study that's been long overdue, and it's been so awesome collaborating with, obviously, the whole team over at the Applied Muscle Development Lab in New York City, and actually finishing the study. And now it feels semi-surreal that we are just a few weeks before being able to preprint it. The reason we're being somewhat not secretive, but a bit reluctant to share results just yet is because we're still waiting for a few things to finish in the background to be included on the paper. And we want to do the paper justice and have everybody give feedback before sharing any sort of results or our interpretation of it. And we're specifically waiting for a bunch of participant footage to be fully anonymized. So we're working on that now, because we are planning on sharing a lot of video footage of the participants training. We're talking like, how many participants would you say? 80%?
Yeah, just over 80%, I think.
Yeah. And actual sets of both conditions, full sets from start to finish, where you can clearly see the range of motion, the tempo employed, and obviously the intensity of effort, which we think should slowly start becoming standard practice in the field, as you hear a lot of complaints about methods of studies, more specifically on how hard participants trained, or sometimes it's not clear exactly what they've done, although it's usually described in text and it's supposed to be described to the utmost detail. Sometimes that is not really clear for many people, especially for those that don't know how to create that visual sort of image, if that makes sense. And we've seen that with the range of motion studies quite a bit.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, it should provide a bit more transparency in the research process. Many of the critiques people tend to throw at studies they don't like are just grasping at straws. I think that if only to reduce the ammunition of some research haters, showing people how it's actually done, probably a good thing. And for people who do try and interpret research in good faith, I think having that extra level of, oh, this is what happened in the study, is helpful. Because back in the day, especially with stricter word limits on journal articles and what have you, the amount of detail involved for the methods was pretty abysmal. And I think we're just slowly trying to shift that narrative a little bit and bring more detail and transparency into the research process. Hopefully videos will help, but we'll see.
Indeed. I remember seeing a few papers from early 2000s, some even older, where, you didn't have basic information about the training that was carried out, or the classic training was carried out as previously described, and then a citation of another paper that cites another paper, and so on and so forth.
This just reminds me of that infamous melatonin rabbit hunting trip we went on, where we heard about a melatonin study where supposedly hundreds of women were given a high dose of melatonin for I think like a year or more straight, and there were essentially no side effects. Those were the reports we heard through the grapevine. And we asked the person who first mentioned it to us to provide the citation, and they're like, oh, that's odd. Couldn't provide it. Don't know where it is. So then we looked into it. We Googled some of the characteristics of the study, and we found around like 50 different citations of that study, but we couldn't find the original study. It just probably may not exist. So yeah, that was a bit of a deep rabbit hole to delve into, only to realize that study doesn't exist. And I think sometimes when all you do is cite previous research that's done something or said something, and you're not citing the actual study, you're often citing a study that cited a study. It's kind of like a game of, is it called Chinese telephone? Where essentially you say something to someone else. Chinese whispers, there you go.
We call it telephone in Greek as well.
Hey, there you go. Foreigners unite. But eventually you just butcher it entirely, and the original study may or may not even exist. So
yeah, exactly. The same issue, the same realization occurred when I did the placebo video for the SBS channel, where I talked about the infamous steroids. We told people they took steroids and they made insane gains sort of studies, where when you look closely, you've heard over the years that there are these, extreme studies that show this and that and the other. But then when we look at the actual methods, you see that the reality of things is much different and much more limited. So I'll do my plugs, and I'll do our plugs actually, and then we get right into it. So if you're enjoying the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps us out. Now, if you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training or your nutrition, Stronger by Science has a team of excellent coaches that can help you. You can learn more at strongerbyScience.com/coaching. We've recently finished a bunch of behind-the-scenes updates in the coaching program, including revised training log sheets alongside other materials that the coaches can use. But overall, if you're interested in solid one-to-one coaching, I think SBS is one of the best places that you can get that. If you want to purchase supplements from a reliable source and support the podcast at the same time, bulksupplements.com with the code SBSPOD for a 5% discount. Don't forget to check out the Facebook and subreddit, the Stronger by Science Facebook and subreddit. These are amongst the most active subreddits and Facebook groups that I have personally seen in our niche. So plenty of posts every day, plenty of people commenting and engaging in discussions around training, nutrition, science, the science of training and nutrition, as well as the odd comment and participation from us as well. But I do know that Mr. Greg Knuckles is fairly active there. Like there's many instances where I see, Greg's typical responses appear, and so you never know. You may get that Greg Knuckles TM response to your question. But all that to say that we are active there as well. Check out the newsletter. So this is something that we've been working on for the past few months. We send you high quality, informative content, no spamming with a bunch of ads. Sign up at strongerbyScience.com/newsletter. You can also get a bunch of free programs when you sign up for the first time. And last but not least, if you have any questions that you want to answer to be answered in the podcast, aside from being part of the Facebook and subreddit communities, where we ask people to ask questions every time there's a new podcast episode coming. You can also email us and send us a voice note or a voice clip or a voice message, whatever you want to call it, at podcast@strongerbyscience.com. All right, so let's get right into it. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is an episode on muscle growth beliefs or ideas that are relatively weak, although they're often presented and often perceived as game changers. We'll start off with forcing advanced periodization for hypertrophy specifically. Now, we're talking about pre-planning training in advance in a manner where everything, including progression, is meticulously planned in a proactive manner. We're talking about lower volume or even lower RPE weeks, deloads when not necessary, pre-planned progression, and so on and so forth. So if we look at the current literature on periodization and hypertrophy, we see that as long as volume is equated between two different protocols, regardless of whether they're periodized or not, the outcomes are more or less the same, which makes sense from a literature standpoint. So if you're completing the same amount of hard sets per week and your intensity of effort is similar, it's likely that even if you have a specific periodization plan that undulates volume from week to week or slowly progresses volume over time, if at the end you're performing the same amount of training volume, it's likely that you're not going to be seeing any different gains in hypertrophy. However, aside from focusing only on the research here, we will obviously look at all these ideas from a coach's perspective because the literature on periodization is limited. And the reason I say that is that we have a few studies where they've obviously compared different programs lasting for 8 to 12 weeks. But in reality, periodization may have some use in some cases where, differently planning a training cycle may allow one to be more consistent and may allow one to actually do more volume over time. However, that, in my opinion, falls more under the category of personalized or individualized programming, where you take an individual's preferences, schedule, recovery in consideration, and you can create a sort of reactive framework that does have some pre-planning involved, but at the same time is still reactive to their recovery, to their performance in the gym, and doesn't necessarily force them to do things. Even though those things, for example, having a deload week after 4 weeks, so not having them do certain things when they're not needed just because you've agreed or you've pre-planned to do so. Now, that was a confusing sentence, I know, but it's meant to keep you on your toes. So now you're like, what did I just hear? So I'll pass it over to Milo to add his 2 cents for that point, and then we'll touch on why we think, forcing advanced periodization may be doing a slight disservice to your muscle growth gains, to your muscle growth.
Hey, so for mind, there's a few things I want to touch on. First, I think when it comes to periodization, as you mentioned, when you look at all the studies on periodization, different styles of periodization and what have you, whether it's linear periodization versus reverse linear versus daily undulating periodization, all of these different periodization styles that do add a lot of complexity to your training. Like usually periodization isn't the first thing that you learn about when you start lifting. It's kind of one of those harder to reach fruits as opposed to the, low-hanging ones. And so generally it's very tempting to think increased complexity will mean increased gains, that you really need to think your way through this, and that's how you get the best gains. In reality, when you look at the meta-analyses on periodization, for hypertrophy specifically, doesn't seem like there is really a benefit, at least the way we've tested periodization. And that brings me to my real point. Do we know that no style of periodization really makes a difference? No. Most studies that look at periodization look at one specific type of periodization. Like even further than just classifying it as linear periodization, they look at certain rep schemes, they look at certain exercises, they look at certain things. So while you are testing the broad concept of periodization and whether or not it impacts muscle growth, the concept itself of periodization is so poorly defined that it's very difficult to test it. And that's why there's been several review papers, one by our PhD supervisors, James Steele and colleagues, and one even older one by John Kiley, which kind of call out to the fact that, hey, periodization is so poorly defined that when we try to operationalize it in the research and experimentally test whether or not it makes a difference for hypertrophy, we don't really have super solid studies to prove, forget the word prove, to substantiate either way whether it makes a difference or not, right? So yeah, that's one big issue with periodization research, and I think that's why it kind of boils down to an absence of evidence versus evidence of absence for the most part. Like, don't get me wrong, the existing research does point towards there not being a big effect, but there is also just not sufficient research on different types of periodization to really tell. Let me give you an example that I know we'll touch on in a little bit. Resensitization. There's a few studies by, I want to say, Ogasawara and colleagues, or maybe Wakahara and colleagues, I always get those confused, about resensitization, where essentially they have participants train either in one study, for example, for 18 weeks straight and just continue training hard, versus in the other group, training hard for 6 weeks, taking 3 weeks entirely off, training hard for another 6 weeks, and taking 3 weeks entirely off again. And they measure muscle growth and strength improvements. And in those couple of studies by these researchers, they find the same muscle growth and strength gains, broadly speaking, between the two groups, despite taking some time off, which points towards one of two things. Resensitization occurring, wherein, because you took some time off, when you come back to training, you're more sensitive to training and you make faster gains. Or, option 2, you're essentially just regaining what you lost during that 3-week training cessation period, and that's why it's faster. And indeed, the concept of regaining lost gains faster than you first gained them is very consistent in the research. It's why muscle memory might be a thing, may or may not have to do mostly with myonuclear domain theory. We have a whole article on that topic on the website if you want to check it out. But it seems like at least taking a week or a couple weeks or even 3 weeks off every now and then probably won't kill your muscle growth. But we only have a few studies on the topic, and we don't have any very intentional experimental comparisons of a well-designed training cessation involving program versus a well-designed non-training cessation involving program. Like, we don't have a study, and I know that Josh Pelland of Data-Driven Strength is planning on doing a study like this, but we don't currently really have a study that is aiming to test the effects of a well-planned training cessation period and whether or not in the long term that can help you make more gains. So for instance, instead of taking 3 weeks off entirely and losing muscle in the process, how about just doing like one weekly session so you can maintain your muscle mass but still perform way lower volumes than usual, and potentially see the physiological resensitization effect that may or may not be there. We don't have studies like that. So to say that periodization is for sure not doing anything is untrue, because we haven't experimentally tested it in that many ways, and certainly not in the ways that might be most ecologically valid or most valid overall. But this brings me to my next point, which is sort of philosophy of science 101, or essentially just how do you maximize your odds of making good gains, right? Assuming we think science is the best way to get at the truth, or at least get incrementally closer to it, I think you can view variables in training, or just research topics in general, and kind of lump them into one of a few categories. For now, I'll just focus on 2 of these categories. The first one is variables that have an absence of evidence. So periodization, to me, kind of falls into that basket, where we do have studies looking at it, but we don't have studies on every type of periodization. So if, for example, Dr. Pak, Mike Israetel, anyone else tells you, hey, you should try this periodization style, it's going to revolutionize your gains, but it involves taking weeks of training off the gym, might be true, might not, we just don't know, because there's an absence of evidence. However, that brings me to the second basket of variables, which is variables where we do have solid evidence of how they relate to hypertrophy. So when Dr. Pak tells you, hey, take a few weeks off training, it'll make you grow more. The truth is, if that lowers your average volume, and we do have solid evidence looking at volume long-term in a variety of settings and relating it to muscle hypertrophy, showing that, hey, on average, the more volume you do to a relatively high level, the more hypertrophy you see. If his periodization style, which has no evidence behind it yet, suggests lowering your volume, which we do have evidence will likely reduce your hypertrophy, I would err on the side of essentially considering the variables where we do have evidence the most strongly, And the ones where we don't have any evidence, even if it's just absence of evidence, I would be putting in like a very much lower priority style. Like, hey, look, if you want to periodize your training so that you start with lower volumes and end up at higher volumes, like RP style, for example, that's totally fine. If your average volume is the same, at the very worst, we don't have evidence suggesting you make worse gains because volume seems to be the main thing. But if the periodization style that you're trying to employ, which has an absence of evidence behind it, is going to harm any variables that we do know have a consistent and positive relationship with hypertrophy, that's probably putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. So that's how I view it for the time being. I think periodization is one of those more complex and yet overrated principles for the time being, just because we don't really have clarity on what periodization style would be best. And so if you want to experiment, as long as you quote unquote respect and don't violate the other more substantiated, more important variables, be my guest. But when it comes to really advanced, really complex styles of periodization, you may just be shooting yourself in the foot. And at the very least right now, complexity-wise, if you're someone who wants to train and gain muscle, there's a good chance you don't need to worry about periodization. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, that's spot on. Exactly the same. And the same, you could make the same argument with proximity to failure as well as, many sort of popularized periodization approaches for hypertrophy. They, aside from ramping up volume over time, they also include weeks where proximity to failure, you're training farther away from failure, and then you're supposed to train harder and harder as time passes. But if you're trying to maximize gains, one could make the argument that being at a closer proximity to failure for the entirety of your training program is likely to yield better muscle growth, especially in the context of, okay, I want to make sure that I'm absolutely ticking every sort of box. So if you fall in that category, as Milo just said, taking those, making sure those basic principles, quote unquote, are addressed, it will be more important than following a program that could theoretically yield more gains, but hasn't been proven to do so yet. In 20 years, if we have a bunch of studies looking at very advanced periodization, showing that, you're going to get more gains, sure. But do you think, and this is just out of curiosity, do you think that even if we had those studies, what would you predict the outcomes to be? So a very advanced periodization program that ends up at the same volume and same sort of average proximity to failure versus just a traditional, 6 to 10 reps, RIR, 0 to 2, same volume, week in, week out. What would you think we would see there?
Yeah, my hunch is that it's mostly average volume, average proximity to failure, and those things that matter. I do think there is room from a coaching perspective for adhering to a trainee's personal preference. So, for example, they get really bored of doing the same exercises for 6 months on end. Does changing your exercise every 3 months really make a difference for hypertrophy? No, probably not. In fact, I think changing exercises too often is a bit overrated for hypertrophy. As long as you have a pretty complete program in the first place, and you're addressing most of the joint functions of a muscle, etc., etc. But I personally don't think there's going to be a huge difference. There is the potential of certain interesting little things, right? Like maybe if your periodization style conforms to your preference very well, you can train harder and thereby make better gains. That's a possibility. But that's more so in the realm of individual differences in preferences and context when it comes to the individual than anything I would recommend on average, like, most people prefer this, Likewise, I could see a potential role for resensitization. So far, the research leads me to think that it's mostly about average volume, and I do suspect the research has found a benefit to training cessation as far as how quickly you gain strength or muscle thereafter. I think that's mostly related to just regaining lost muscle and strength versus like all of a sudden you're making noob-like gains, And that brings me to deloads, which I know you have on the outline. I'll give my quick take before you delve into the research. I know you're, raring to go about the research. But when it comes to deloads, I think the approach I take is that oftentimes proactively planning deloads, especially for most people who struggle to spend that much time in the gym in the first place, like they have a busy lifestyle, etc., proactively planning deloads too frequently just lowers your average volume. And for many people, recovery is not so much an issue as it is just spending enough time in the gym and being consistent at a relatively high volume, right? And so I think proactively planning deloads for most trainees or most clients, if you're a coach, doesn't make a ton of sense. If you have a trainee or you're a trainee that spends 6 days in the gym a week, 7 days in the gym a week, maybe even double sessions or what have you, and you do consistently find that your performance takes a hit for a few days at a time when you overdo things slightly in the gym, then yeah, maybe you're one of the rare lifters who does benefit from a deload more often because you are truly training sufficiently hard, sufficiently much to cause a large amount of fatigue and start struggling with recovery, so you need a deload. But I think I'm going to quote a random number, 80+% of lifters, I don't think deloads are a thing you need to worry about too much. I think it's mostly when you're on vacation and you don't have access to a gym, or you don't feel like it, or you're trying to spend time with your family, or you have a busy time at work, or what have you have exam season. That is when you should take a deload, and not every insert ratio every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks. Not that, rather let your lifestyle dictate it, because for many people, never taking a deload might actually cause more growth. And that's a hot take, but for many people, I think that is the case.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. And I do think there's a heavy dose of nocebo that has followed deloads and the word fatigue in general. And I remember before meeting you that I had some form of nocebo as well when it came to like heavy lifting or deadlifts, and the idea that, hey, you have to be like really careful with how much fatigue you get from each workout, and if you overdo it, you then need to take it easy. But in reality, if we look at the research, the very limited research that we have on deloads, and I think the one study, which is also the first actual study looking at the concept, so looking at actual deloads, we see that forcing a deload when it wasn't necessarily needed after 4 weeks. So 2 groups of resistance trained individuals, one trained for 9 weeks consecutively, the other group trained for 4 weeks, took a week off, and then continued training for 4 weeks, although they didn't really need that deload. So having that proactive deload there did not make a difference for hypertrophy or strength, although for some measures of strength was slightly reduced actually after taking the week off. But the bit of evidence that we have at the moment shows that forcing the random deload just to force it is not going to harm your gains, which is good for people who may need to take a week off for whatever reason mid-training. But at the same time, as far as resensitization or any sort of favorable outcomes, it didn't do much. And when we look at data on coaches and strength and physique sport coaches at the highest level, they on average seem to favor a more reactive approach to deloads, where you essentially take an easy week of training, reducing volume by 30 to 50%, lowering intensity of effort a bit, and just, taking it easy for 5 to 7 days. And most people preferred reactive deloads. The issue that you often have with deloads in practice, and like forcing the continuous training, is that in practice, as you also mentioned, people have other things that come up, and having that proactive deload forced or like set there and set in stone may actually lead to that person training less and then having to take another week or 2 weeks off because of life commitments. So yeah, I'm on the same page here. Keeping those for when they're needed is likely going to be fine. I think deloads are one of the most overthought sort of variables when it comes to muscle growth and to a certain extent strength. I'll let you ramble on about fatigue and knowing whether you're actually fatigued, because that's something we discuss a lot between us. Ramble like a couple of sentences. So people will often say, "Oh, I'm feeling very fatigued," or this or that or the other. But what would you say are some like solid ways to actually know that you're fatigued besides, "Oh, I feel fatigued"?
Yeah. So a few things. One, when you look at the research on overtraining from lifting weights, it is quite rare. Like, don't get me wrong, we don't have the best research on overtraining in resistance training. We don't have many studies that use similar protocols as what you would use in practice typically. But simply put, when you look at the research on lifting that we have, true overtraining syndrome, which implies a reduction in training performance lasting longer than a month, and that then takes a long time to reverse out of and get back to how strong you were pre-overtraining, That has almost never happened, if not ever, in the research. And we have put people through some pretty intense protocols, like daily 1 rep maxes, like several 1 rep maxes a day for a few weeks on end, you know? Like we've put people through some pretty gruesome protocols, never mind the infamous 52-set quad study, right? Like even in that study, they still saw a benefit of that insane volume where on average they were doing 42 weekly sets of quads, right? They still grew more muscle, directionally at least, with 42 sets versus like, I think 32 or 27, right? So in the research at least, we do observe more growth from pretty high volumes on a per muscle level. We also don't consistently observe overtraining being a thing that happens readily, at least, from the protocols we use in the research. Practically, I think the best way to look at recovery and tell whether or not fatigue is something you need to worry about would be, is your performance consistent or increasing week to week? So for example, if last week on the deadlift, you were able to hit 4 or 5 or 5 reps, this week you're able to hit 4 or 5 reps again. By definition, in a sports science sense at least, you are recovered. And so the amount of training you're currently doing and your overall lifestyle and how conducive it is to recovery, those two things are at least matching up, so you're recovering just fine week to week. If in fact you improved week to week and you were able to deadlift, say, 4 or 5 or 6 this week, fatigue is even less of an issue because you weren't fatigued enough to prevent any improvement in performance. The only real time where your performance, which I think should be the main way to track recovery and whether or not it is matching up to how much fatigue you're generating through training, is if you see performance drop for a few workouts in a row. And in fact, when you see performance drop consistently for a few workouts in a row, maybe say a week or maybe 2 weeks, you enter what is colloquially referred to in sports science as functional or potentially non-functional overreaching. Functional overreaching essentially just refers to when you take a training program and you intentionally train more than you can recover from and create more fatigue than your lifestyle allows you to recover from for like a week or two, with the expectation that by doing so, you are then allowing for supercompensation, or essentially because you train so much and so hard, and you then allow for functional overreaching to occur, followed by recovery period, you get more gains than you would had you not trained as much. That's why it's called functional. In the end, you get more gains from it. And that typically involves a period of 1 to 2 weeks where your performance is worse than usual, right? Nearly no one I've ever spoken to has actually achieved this, like even this lowest tier of quote-unquote overtraining. Then you get into non-functional overreaching, which is your performance is taken a hit for a few weeks in a row. It's called non-functional because the excessive amount of fatigue has lasted for so long that any potential gains that you're seeing are being outweighed by muscle damage or whatever nondescript factors. Keep in mind, this is more of a conceptual model than anything that we have a ton of research on anyways. But that is also something I've not really seen anyone achieve, a prolonged decrease in performance lasting 2 weeks or more. And then, if you go even further than that and you see a reduction in performance of a month or more, that is when you reach quote-unquote overtraining syndrome. And that reduction in performance then is supposed to take several weeks to reverse out of and get back to your previous levels. Now, in practice, as a coach who's coached at this point hundreds of clients, I've seen people potentially functionally overreach for a few days. I don't think I've ever seen anyone non-functionally overreach, and I've certainly never seen anyone overtrain. So, anecdotally, it's just not a common thing. I think performance is by far your best gauge of whether or not you're recovering. Performance can be influenced by a variety of things. Like, I'm sure you've experienced this. If you had a really bad night of sleep or a few, you might feel like your performance took a hit, right? And that's probably because that impacts your performance. So even lifestyle factors that correlate and cause better or worse recovery, those are taken into consideration when you look at performance. Really bad night of sleep, you might perform worse. And that is kind of indicative of, hey, your recovery wasn't as good. Really stressed with exams, you might perform worse. If you've been really blasting the volume recently, and you did 20 sets of legs yesterday, and you try and squat again today, maybe you see that your performance took a hit. Because, hey, guess what? You didn't properly recover from yesterday. But with everything I've said, if your performance is consistent week to week or improving, recovery probably is an issue. And even if you have a bad workout, or even two, there's a good chance that could just be a fluctuation. Like you'll always have fluctuations in your readiness from day to day. That doesn't necessarily mean that as a whole, your training program is excessive for how much you can recover from. So what I would look for as a coach and as someone who trains is if for a week or more-ish, or at least a few workouts in a row, I see a reduction in performance on most exercises, or at least on most exercises for a muscle group, because you can definitely locally overreach as well. Like if your bicep curls all take a hit for a whole week, yeah, maybe your recovery isn't adding up to how much bicep training you're doing. But that happens really rarely. Far more commonly do people have lifestyle constraints that cause them to need to deload. Whether it's, hey, I feel really stressed from exams, and I feel like adding in training on top of it might make me more stressed personally. Sure, that's a valid reason to deload. Yes, exercise is good for managing stress, but that can be a valid reason to deload. Or I'm on holidays, and I don't have a nice gym, and I don't really enjoy training while on holidays. That's a valid reason to deload. But purely fatigue-related reasons to deload, like as in you're struggling to recover, as gauged by performance, that is quite rare. It does happen, but it's quite rare. And I think most of the time for most clients, deloads should be taken as your lifestyle dictates versus it being something you need to do to prevent the boogeyman of, I'm going to overtrain. You don't just overtrain. Overtraining is very noticeable and occurs typically as via a reduction in performance that lasts days and days, you know? So yeah, I think overtraining is something I was a lot more worried about when I got into training, but it's not really something that you accidentally get into. You need to be spending a lot of time in the gym typically to even achieve that, or have extremely poor recovery, which again, you can tell if your performance is getting worse session to session. Ramble over.
That was a really nice ramble. And yeah, just a very quick 2 cents before we go to the next thing. From my coaching experience, you often get a client who says, hey, bad week, performance wasn't great this week. I, lost a couple of reps versus last week, and I feel fatigued in general. But in many cases, I am a bit reluctant to instantly trigger a deload, and I rather go, okay, let's give it a few more days, see if this trend continues. Obviously, in the absence of any extreme symptoms, like if somebody says I went to the gym and nearly fainted or whatever, I only managed 2 exercises out of the usual 8. Yeah, that's different. But in many cases, you have these sort of week-to-week fluctuations, and then all of a sudden, what do you know? Another 3 weeks of continuous training, everything feels fine. So triggering that deload the moment you see a regression in performance, as some people are, just looking for, the fatigue boogeyman, and they're like, okay, but I dropped off and I did 1 rep less than last week and I had to decrease weight a bit. Like the co-founders there from Lifestyle Factors, as you mentioned, are so great that I'd say give it a bit of time unless something extreme is happening. And it's likely that you may be able to go for a bit longer before you need an actual easy week of training. Awesome. Also, the idea that training complexity needs to severely increase with training status or training age is something that I don't heavily buy unless you have an insanely complex lifestyle schedule. Yeah, then you may need to play around with variables a bit more. But the classic, I don't know if you remember the starting strength graph where it was like beginner, and then as you go on more advanced, things had to be so super complex. Intuitively does make some sense, but even volume recommendations wise, I'd say, things don't really have to change much, even for people that have been training for 10 to 20 years. Cool. The other sort of weak muscle growth belief that we have is training primarily in the 12 to 20 rep range. Now, this is something that you often see when talking about hypertrophy training, and you often see mentioned in strength training cycles where there's this idea that, okay, you're doing hypertrophy training, now you have to be doing higher reps, and the idea that higher reps are somewhat more hypertrophic than lower reps, even if lower reps means, being in the 5 to 10 rep range. Now, this, aside from the belief that different rep ranges will cause massive differences in muscle growth, which, if we look at the re-examination of the strength and endurance continuum, we see that you could do lower reps, you could do 3, 4, 5 reps, you could do 10 reps, you could do 20 reps. As long as you're close to failure, you're likely going to see similar increases in muscle growth. However, if we then look at the proximity to failure research, and more specifically the famous by now Halperin et al. Exploratory meta-analysis, we see that things become a bit iffy after 12 reps when it comes to people gauging their proximity to failure. And anecdotally, this is something that I've seen in practice quite a bit. So Although for some people listening, let's say including ourselves, we are relatively confident. We train very close to failure or to failure for the majority of time. So even if we do a 12 to 20 rep set, it's likely that it's fine because we are actually hitting failure at the end. But for many trainees that I've worked with, once you go above that 12 rep range, things become a bit more difficult, and you see people having a harder time gauging how close they are to failure, which is also supported by the literature. And we have been big proponents of, and that's just between us for our own training and for client training, of not shying away from heavy sets for hypertrophy, talking in the 5 to 8 rep range for the majority of things, and essentially forcing those heavy sets. And just, we did a joke video called the full stack method, where we try to do the full stack on every stack loaded machine in the gym. But in reality, sort of forcing those heavy sets, one, you're getting the same muscle growth benefits. It's not like you're getting less as long as you're at the 5+ rep range. Plus, your ability to gauge proximity to failure becomes much easier, especially if you are just at the bottom of that range every week. So yeah, from my point of view, the idea that hypertrophy training needs to be high rep or higher rep than higher rep than 5 to 8 reps, I think that's a relatively weak belief that may be costing some people some gains.
For sure. I think I have a slightly different stance on things, but I'll take you through it. First, I think there is a kernel of truth to, hey, do somewhat higher reps for hypertrophy. Because if you look at the research on sets of much less than about 5 reps, you do see that on a set per set basis, they cause less growth. In a classic study by, Mattox and colleagues, I got it, Mattox and colleagues, they compared doing sets of single reps, or essentially practicing one rep maxes, to doing actual hypertrophy training of, I think, 10 reps per set. And that was in untrained lifters using a within participant design, where one arm trained with the 1 rep maxes and one arm trained with the sets of hypertrophy training. And essentially, even in untrained lifters, doing those sets of 1 rep weren't sufficient to cause any hypertrophy. And in fact, pre to post, they actually lost a bit of muscle in that limb. Whereas the arm doing the traditional hypertrophy training of, say, 10 reps did grow some muscle. And when you zoom out and look at other studies that are similar in nature, where they compare sets of less than 5 reps to sets of more than 5 reps, you do generally see more hypertrophy with sets of more than 5 reps. So I do think you can go too low, right? That's for sure. You can probably also go too high. So we have a few studies looking at more moderate intensity training of, say, doing sets of 10 to 15 typically, or even 6 to 8, compared to doing really high rep sets with, say, between 10 to 40% of your max. And essentially, if you look at those studies, you see that the studies that use less than about 20 or 30% of your max on a set per set basis, those sets that you're doing for a ton of reps with really light weight are less beneficial. You grow less muscle from them. But the studies that use at least 20 to 30% of your max, which by the way is equivalent to about 50 reps, if not a bit more, per set, at least on the first set, you do see the same growth as, say, a set of 8, provided you go to failure. Additionally, there is some research around using a variety of rep ranges, right? This has been summarized in an in-house meta-analysis by Zach Robinson over on the website. But basically, there's some preliminary evidence that when you combine a variety of rep ranges, so you do some heavier work in the 5 to 10 rep range, some more moderate work in the 10 to 20 rep range, and maybe some lighter work as well, that might lead to a bit more hypertrophy, not by a big amount, than just doing 1 rep range, like always staying heavy 5 to 10, or what have you. That being said, there are some confounders there, like there's just not that many studies, some of the study designs are a bit iffy, but it's probably worth a try if you're trying to optimize hypertrophy. So those are kind of like the caveats to that statement. Now, would I still recommend training primarily in the 12 to 20 rep range? No. I think most of your training for hypertrophy should take place in the 5 to 12 rep range. As I mentioned, you can go too heavy, get below 5 reps, no ideal for hypertrophy. But, as Pak mentioned, we did perform with our own lab, shout out Halperin and colleagues, a meta-regression on how close to failure people are as you change the repetition target. And essentially, up until around 12 reps per set, people are pretty accurate. They underestimate how many reps they can do by less than 1. So on average, they're less than 1 rep off how close to failure they think they are. People do tend to underestimate themselves. So if they think they have 1 more rep in the tank, and they're doing instead of 8, say, on average, they're closer to about 2 more reps in the tank. So as a general heuristic, if you're trying to train for hypertrophy and you want to be accurate in how close to failure you train 1 rep harder than you think you should. But when you get above 12 reps, that discrepancy starts growing quite rapidly. And although there are fewer studies there, by the time you get to like 20, 25 reps, you're often talking about underestimating yourself by 5 reps. So we're talking about a much bigger discrepancy, which could meaningfully impact how much hypertrophy you see. For that reason alone, and alongside the fact that most people find higher rep training quite uncomfortable in the research and in practice, doing like 50 to 80% of your training in the 5 to 10, maybe 10 to 15 rep range is probably worth doing. Doing most of your work in those rep ranges is going to allow you to train sufficiently close to failure to maximize hypertrophy. All right. Now, you might rebut. What about rep speed? I can tell how close to failure I am because I look at rep speed, and if it's slow enough, I know that I'm close to failure. On the one hand, I agree. The average concentric velocity of a rep, so essentially, on average, how fast was your rep during the concentric phase or lifting phase, is generally a very good predictor of how close to failure you are. That is assuming you're being explosive and forceful and intentional during that lifting phase, which you probably should be for both strength and hypertrophy anyways. That is a pretty good predictor of proximity to failure, but there is one caveat, which is that for higher rep sets specifically, the last rep before you reach failure tends to be a bit faster than if you're doing low rep work. So if, for example, you're doing a set of 3 to failure, your last rep on the bench might have an average concentric velocity of, say, 0.15 or 0.2 meters per second, right? If you, say, did a set of 20 on bench, your last rep before failure might be at like 0.3 instead. So it can look fairly different when you're going for higher rep sets versus lower rep sets in terms of how your rep speed correlates to how close to failure you are. So you can definitely use rep speed, and I think it's a better metric than nearly anything else. But it's worth keeping in mind that it can be different from lower rep sets and higher rep sets. And importantly, your perception of rep speed, although there is some research now showing that it's a decent proxy for actual rep speed, I do suspect with higher rep sets, as was kind of shown in our meta regression, because of how uncomfortable it is, even if you're paying attention to rep speed, you do still tend to undershoot, because ultimately you're perceiving rep speed. Unless you're measuring it, you're just perceiving it, and your perception of things can definitely be moderated by, oh, I'm doing leg extensions for a set of 20, my quads are burning, I'm out of breath, I don't want to be here. You might feel like your rep is pretty slow, but in reality it was pretty fast. And that certainly adds up with my coaching experience where if I tell a client to go to failure on 5 to 8 reps, they'll do it no problem. If I tell them to do it on 20 reps, usually we need to add some more load, typically. So yeah, all that to say, I agree. I think most of your training should take place in the 5 to 8 rep range, 5 to 15, whatever. But there's some benefits and limitations to some higher rep work. I don't think most training should take place in the 12 to 20 rep range, like you mentioned.
Awesome. Yeah. The Romanian deadlift and variations of the squat are notorious for those sets where you know from experience as well, especially if you wear a belt, that even if you're like at a 8 RIR or something, at some point Romanian deadlifts start feeling horrible, and then you look back at the video even of yourself and you're like, oh, that looks like the warm-up set. This is something that we grew up hearing quite a bit, is the idea that you have to get strong in order to get big, that you have to focus on strength in order to become as big as possible, with things like success leaves clues being quoted, and look at the biggest bodybuilders, they are usually also the strongest, and if you get your insert traditional barbell lift up to whatever, you are going to be massive, and that's where your focus should be. Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we are going to look at the idea that focusing on strength is the best way to maximize hypertrophy, where if we look at the volume recommendations for strength and maximizing strength alongside the proximity to failure recommendations for strength, if you take a route where you are trying to see the numbers, the number on the bar go up, you can do so very effectively and arguably in an optimal, quote unquote, manner, while at the same time being in a suboptimal environment for muscle growth. So looking at the Robinson et al. Meta-analysis on proximity to failure and strength and hypertrophy, being further away from failure will allow you to probably make better strength gains. At the same time, when it comes to volume recommendations, you need much less volume before you hit a plateau as far as strength gains go. So if you're trying to really get your deadlift, your squat, your bench press up, you simply focus on that, you're likely going to take an approach that is not going to be optimal for muscle growth. However, there is and there was the belief that, you should get stronger before training for hypertrophy in order to handle more load so that you can potentially have more mechanical tension, among other sort of points that were brought up, in order to then maximize hypertrophy. And there was actually a study published relatively recently, so in 2021, by Carvalho et al., called "Is Stronger Better? Influence of a Strength Phase Followed by a Hypertrophy Phase on Muscular Adaptations in Resistance Trained Men." Now, here they essentially had a 3-week strength period where they did sets of 1 to 3 reps before having a 5-week hypertrophy oriented period where they did sets of 8 to 12 reps, or just a hypertrophy sort of period. The other group just did hypertrophy work for the entirety of the study where they did just 4 to 8 reps for 8 weeks. And actually, the group that did the strength work before the hypertrophy work did see greater gains in muscle growth and muscle strength. Now, what do you think of these results? Actually, do you want me to add my 2 cents first? Sure. Cool. So, interesting study, and maybe there is something to varying rep ranges. However, just the inclusion of a 3-week strength training period in a study where we have 26 individuals, so sample size, as per usual in our field, is not that great. I would interpret those results with some caution. I think 3 weeks is not nearly enough time to really draw strong inferences from the fact that they did see more muscle growth over the long term. It's interesting that they did 1 to 3 reps, but I assume because they were training heavy, because they were supposed to be training to a repetition maximum, they were also training very close to failure. So it may have been just a case of, hey, these were two groups that were both training very close to failure, performing similar exercises, and over 8 weeks, the group that did the strength work ended up getting more strength and hypertrophy gains because they trained heavier, and they also trained maybe a bit closer to failure. At the same time, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock on this as a study to support the idea that you need to have a distinct strength phase before your hypertrophy work, but rather as evidence in support of ensuring that you're varying rep ranges, and you do include some lower rep range training in your training, which shouldn't necessarily be 1 to 3 reps, but in general, having exercises that you are performing with a heavier load at lower reps, just for the sake of ensuring that you're taking any sort of box that may need to be ticked for maximizing muscle growth. But I would not necessarily, based on the current literature, looking at high versus low load resistance training, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock on the idea that you have to dedicate multiple weeks of strength training before a hypertrophy phase in order to absolutely maximize gains, because you could just by varying your repetition ranges and doing some heavy sets for some of your training, some high rep ranges, as we just said, I think that ticks all those boxes pretty effectively, and you could run the risk at least in practice, if you put out this information, or at least you make a big deal out of strength phases being super important before a hypertrophy phase, where people spin their wheels for much longer than needed, they get strong. Obviously, they'll get bigger as well, because training close to failure, even with low reps, will lead to some muscle growth. But I think overall, in the long term, having distinct strength phases may result in less growth than having just a program that includes a variety of rep ranges and you're ensuring that you're doing enough volume and training very close to failure.
Yeah, this is an interesting argument to me, because it's almost diametrically opposite to power building is killing your gains. So on the one hand, you have people who say power building is killing your gains, when in reality, as we expressed in a previous episode on power building, you can make great size strength gains at the same time. On the diametrically opposite side of things, you have people saying you need to get strong to get big. So if you just get your squat to 4 plates, your legs will be massive. And indeed, when you look around people who can squat 4 plates, they certainly have bigger legs on average than people who can squat 2 plates, right? So at face value, it seems kind of true and interesting. Not to belabor the point, I went into this in the power building episode, but there are a number of differences between how to best train for strength and how to best train for hypertrophy, such that whenever you try and increase how much of one you're getting, you're going to be trading off some amount of the other. I think it's less than people commonly assume. I think you can get maybe 80% or something of your strength gains, of your potential strength gains, while getting, say, around 80% of your potential hypertrophy gains. But just to give a quick rundown of the factors, proximate to failure is different between ideal strength training and ideal hypertrophy training. Ideal hypertrophy training, probably closer to failure, seems to yield more muscle growth, whereas farther from failure, seems to yield the same strength gains for probably less fatigue. Volume, as Pak mentioned, some behind-the-scenes research and existing research even suggests that around 10 sets a week per lift, you might see roughly your best strength gains, whereas for hypertrophy, we haven't really found an upper ceiling yet, even as far as 20, 30, 40 sets a week per muscle. So quite a big discrepancy there. Third, we have progressive overload. For strength training, you're probably best off adding weight to the bar week to week, whereas for hypertrophy, it's more flexible. So at the very least, you have to make a choice there. Then you have exercise variation versus specificity. If you're trying to get stronger, you'll need to be a bit more specific. So if someone just tells you, hey, get strong to get big, and you chase that 2-plate bench, 3-plate bench, 4-plate bench, you will be probably more specific than is ideal to get big. We have a meta-analysis on exercise variation by Cassiano or Nunes and colleagues, I believe, where essentially using some degree of exercise variation is superior for inducing muscle hypertrophy adaptations. Next, we have rep range specificity versus variation. As I mentioned earlier, for hypertrophy, there might be a slight benefit to varying your rep ranges, right? Whereas for strength, you mostly want to be specific and train in the rep range of your target strength improvement. If you're trying to improve your max, you should mostly be doing sets of close to 1 rep, right? Likewise, the rep ranges that are best for building muscle versus strength are not the same. As I just mentioned, for strength, close to your rep target is where you should be, whereas for hypertrophy, anywhere between 5 and 50 is beneficial. So for most people, when they mean getting strong, they mean getting strong at heavy weights, so doing sets of mostly 1 to 3, not ideal. Next, we have range of motion specificity. So based on my own meta-analysis, there does seem to be a specificity component to range of motion. So if you want to get stronger or better through a certain range of motion, you'll see your best gains if you train through that specific range of motion. So for a powerlifter who's squatting to parallel is mostly what they should be doing. For hypertrophy, on the other hand, the stretch seems important. So again, there is a divergence of approaches there. Next, we have exercise selection. Again, specificity for powerlifters versus just picking exercise that load the lengthened position a bit more, get you into a more lengthened position, potentially a bit more stable, essentially not needing to be as specific and considering more hypertrophy-related factors. And finally, we have rest times. For strength, you probably want to rest a bit longer, whereas for hypertrophy, recent meta-analysis by our own research group suggests that 1 to 2 minutes of rest between sets is a great starting place and will potentially maximize hypertrophy. All that to say, there's like 10 different factors where optimal strength training and hypertrophy training practices differ. Now, back in 2020, I believe, when the Carvalho study came out, it did cause some hype, where essentially preceding a hypertrophy phase with a strength phase led to greater hypertrophy gains than just training for hypertrophy the whole time. So essentially getting stronger first and then doing hypertrophy training was better for overall muscle building. The reason I'm not entirely sold is twofold. One, the sample size, when you divide it across 2 groups as it was, is 13 per group, which not a whole lot, not ideal, not very well powered. Second, and arguably more importantly, given also that it's a small sample size, this is one of the only, or if not the only study I'm aware of that has these sort of findings. And when you consider all the individual bodies of research on rep ranges, proximity to failure, volume, exercise variation, range of motion specificity, rest times, exercise selection, showing that there is a divergence, the general idea of focusing on getting strong to get big just seems very misguided. There's just too many things that are conflicting for me to say that, yep, just get stronger and you'll get your biggest, There's just too many things that don't add up. And ultimately, saying that stronger people are bigger is very informative, but it would be a lot more informative, for example, if the strong person had trained one arm to get stronger and one arm for hypertrophy. And then it turned out the arm they trained to get stronger was actually also bigger. But in reality, what we see is that the strongest people are also quite big, but that could be due to a variety of factors that have nothing to do with their training, whether it's PD use, whether it's great genetics, whether it's great nutrition, getting a lot of the basics right. So don't get me wrong, you can focus on getting strong and it'll get you pretty big, but if you want to get your biggest, getting strong isn't the way there. So,
mic drop. Disconnect the mic and slam it on the wall. Yeah, definitely agree. Nice. That was very wholesome. Last but not least, and we'll just briefly touch on this because we've talked about this at length before. Pun unintended. I don't know if there was a pun there. Length. Long muscle length. Am I right? So not paying attention to some
partials. Go on.
Length and partials are my life. It's as evident by whoever listens to that song. It sticks with them. It's a solid song. Respect to you and Josh for making it. Anyways, the idea of not paying attention to exercise selection. Now you may be like, hey, Pak, who preaches that? Like, is that really a belief? And yes, it is in the same sort of category as, you got to get strong to get big. It's the idea that, stop overcomplicating things, pick 5 exercises or like 5 of the basics, just do those. And that's all you need to maximize muscle growth. But as we previously touched on, exercise selection can play a role for those looking to absolutely maximize gains. More specifically, we had our study where we looked at exercise selection and lower body regional hypertrophy, seeing that, hey, the leg extension preferentially targeted the rectus femoris more than the leg press, and the seated calf raise was worse for overall calf growth than the straight leg calf raise. Similarly, tricep work performed overhead may lead to greater overall tricep hypertrophy. But in general, the idea that all you need to absolutely maximize muscle growth is just a handful of exercises that you like, a handful of compound exercises, and you don't need to overthink things, is not entirely true and is more on the weak belief side of things. Now, keep in mind, you can get pretty jacked, and getting jacked is different from maximizing muscle growth. A rugby player or an American football player, for the listeners, will look absolutely jacked, but they may have not necessarily absolutely maximized their hypertrophy of the hypertrophy of their, triceps or leg extensions. They may still have big legs because they can squat a lot and so on and so forth. So yeah, just very briefly touching on that, I don't think we need to get into a whole lot of detail here as we've done in the past. Anything you want to add there?
I disagree. It's time for detail.
Let's do it.
So first, to touch on the football player example, or rugby player. I think that on average, the people who are drawn to simplicity and just do a few basic lifts and get jacked, it's kind of a survivorship bias situation where, started lifting, was told to focus on the basics, did the basics, got jacked, life is good, don't need to worry about it. Versus people who do that, just get fat, aka me, and then realize, maybe that wasn't the best approach, and then are actually, quote unquote, forced to seek out a bit more of an intellectual approach to training. So there's several studies that just run counter to this idea entirely. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there is a meta-analysis by Nunes or Cassiano and colleagues on exercise variation, where varying your exercises a little bit at least, not a ton, but at least a little bit, is better for overall hypertrophy. There's also one study by Brandau and colleagues, where essentially they compared 4 conditions. Just doing the skull crusher, just doing the bench press, doing the skull crusher and the bench press in that order, so skull crusher first, then the bench, and then finally doing the bench, then the skull crusher. So essentially doing either of the exercises on their own, or combining them in a certain order, either starting with isolation, then compound, or doing compound and isolation. And basically, they measured cross-sectional area of the triceps, all 3 heads, and the pectoralis major. And when it comes to hypertrophy of the different muscles, as you'd expect, just doing the skull crusher didn't grow the pecs. Whereas if you include the bench, you grew your pecs. So at least, just on a very facetious level, you need some variation if you want to target certain muscles, because if you don't target their joint functions, you're not going to grow them. So some variation is required just on a fundamental level, obviously. But then, if you look at the increase in triceps size, for example, the group that just did skull crushers saw a decent increase in tricep size of about 10% or so, pre to post. Whereas the group just doing bench press saw about a 5% increase in their tricep size. So off the bat, if someone told you, hey, just bench, you'll get your upper body training taken care of, then just do some pull-ups and you're good. Based on this study, your triceps wouldn't be growing as much as possible. And in fact, then they looked at combining the bench press and skull crusher in either order. And in both of those cases, they saw an additional sort of like, compared to just doing skull crushers, an additional 2 to 5% extra growth. So instead of 10% growth pre to post, around 12 to 13-ish thereabouts. And specifically, it seemed like certain heads responded better to the skull crusher versus the bench press. So at the very least, you want some degree of exercise variation even when it comes to just the triceps. And I think as a general heuristic, doing at least 2 exercises per muscle group, up to 4 for certain muscle groups that are more complex, like your back involving your lats, upper back, etc., is a wise decision. Like most of the studies on the topic point to that. There's very few studies I'm aware of, if any, that find greater hypertrophy when just doing one exercise and focusing on the basics versus doing a variety of exercises with the same volume, same relative intensity. They generally find more growth with that approach. So as tempting as it is, and as adequate as it might be for a beginner, you probably will see more growth if you don't just focus on the big lifts or just do the basics, you know?
Yep. Yeah, survivorship bias, that's a really good point. Yeah. Thank you for just tearing down my argument and destroying it. I think it's time to touch on some audience questions now on the topic, starting off with an absolute Milo Wolf patent question. Not really though, but that's something that you recently covered. So Randy718 from Reddit says, I feel like that there's a lot of emphasis on movements which load the stretch position in hypertrophy training these days. Thank you, Milo. But is there any benefit to just straight up stretching after a hard set? Like say I do a bunch of overhead tricep extensions and then just sit there and let the cable pull down on my tricep. Does that accomplish anything? What if I just do a bunch of leg extensions and then just do a standing quad stretch after?
Yeah, so there is some research looking at the idea of interset stretching. To my knowledge, that research has taken place mostly in the calves, quads, and pecs, if I'm not mistaken. The results are relatively favorable, but there's remarkably few studies, and importantly, they're generally not volume equated. So it's unclear whether or not you could just do an extra set and get the same sort of benefits. For the time being, there's just not enough research for me to endorse the idea fully. That's kind of my stance on it. But yeah, who knows? In the future, maybe. That's kind of my stance on interset stretching for the time being for muscle hypertrophy. Anything to add, Wilo Mulf?
I would just add to not necessarily like, yeah, if you want to do it as a whatever, if you like it, if you like the way it feels, sure, do it. But I wouldn't sort of change the basics of training very close to failure and then and substituting that with, okay, I did 5 reps and I had 5 reps in reserve and then I just sat and stretched during an overhead tricep extension. So yeah, you can add it as sort of like a, hey, I'm playing around with this thing. There's very limited research showing maybe there is something to it, but I would not treat it as an actual training approach. Then Mila Highlife from Reddit says, soreness as a heuristic for recovery and growth, such as the statement, if you aren't sore all the next day, you should do more work next session. If you're still sore when it's time to hit that muscle again, you've done too much, aren't recovered, and should do less. Dr. Mike says something like this a lot, which is seemingly against the grain of the conventional wisdom on the topic. Now, you've had a bunch of chats with Dr. Mike himself, and I think you have reached a middle ground in the sense that soreness is not necessarily the best predictor for muscle growth or recovery per se, as in like, especially from session to session or like from day to day, but it can still give you some idea if you account for other variables like training performance and just overall feeling and sort of guide your training. So if you're insanely sore and performance has been dropping off and you're feeling very fatigued, yes, you can triangulate that data and probably come to the conclusion that, cool, you got to take a step back. However, the idea that just being sore means that, oh, you've absolutely, entered the non-recovery zone, or there's alarm bells going off in your body and you have to take it easy the next session. I don't necessarily think there's much evidence to support that.
Pretty much. I think, for one, exercise-induced muscle damage, or EIMD, as it's often called in the research, is relatively poorly understood as a phenomenon. So we have a whole video on the topic on the SBS channel if you want to check it out with Dr. Mike. But first of all, it's relatively poorly understood as to what exactly it is correlated with. And when it comes to soreness specifically, as a means of predicting muscle damage, the evidence isn't all that compelling. So we have a study by Nosaka and colleagues, for example, from 2005, where they attempted to see whether or not delayed onset muscle soreness from eccentric contractions in the arms were correlated with physiological markers of muscle damage and even performance. So, for example, creatine kinase concentrations, performance in the next few days thereafter, whether or not soreness was at least associated with those markers of muscle damage. And to make a long story short, they were at best weakly correlated with it. And importantly, the way in which soreness was assessed did seem to matter. So they assessed soreness in one of three ways: either relaxed while flexing the arm, so full flexion of the elbow, or while extending it. So a few different positions palpation, extension, flexion. Those were the three. So either being palpated by a researcher, having your arm extended, or having it flexed and seeing how much of a soreness response you had on a visual scale that you rated. And then seeing whether or not those ratings, one, correlated with each other, and two, with markers of muscle damage. For one, the method in which soreness was assessed seemed to matter, such that soreness ratings in different positions and different methods, so either arm extension, flexion, or while being palpated, correlated to each other relatively weakly at around only, I think, 0.3, 0.4, if I recall correctly, which is pretty weak. So certainly the way in which you assess soreness seems to matter a whole lot if you're going to use it as a predictive means of, am I recovered, am I growing, etc. So that's already an issue, because whenever I see soreness being recommended as a heuristic, I don't really see a standardized way of implementing it. I don't see people saying, all right, always do it while relaxed, or always do it while warming up, or always do it in this. And that can really impact how sore you feel, as it turns out, by these measurements only being correlated pretty weakly. So if these measurements are already correlated that weakly, and there are no clear guidelines given by practitioners on how to assess soreness, to then thereby predict muscle growth or recovery, that's a huge issue in my book. The second issue is when it came to correlations or associations between that and measures of muscle damage, such as creatine kinase, the correlations were almost all non-significant and very weak, in the realm of 0.1 to 0.3, I think, if I recall correctly. And finally, when it came to performance, which is kind of the crux of the argument to an extent, as I mentioned earlier, I think performance is the best metric for assessing recovery from a workout. If you're performing well, in all likelihood, you have nothing to worry about. When it came to performance, soreness was actually positively correlated with performance, as measured via asymmetric force, which is kind of a very unskilled test of strength. So when participants were more sore, they were able to produce more force. Not by a lot, it was a super weak correlation, but just to indicate that even the directionality of the relationship was the opposite of what was expected. So when you combine the fact that the different ratings of soreness correlate with each other quite poorly, and the fact that soreness, no matter which way you assessed it, didn't really correlate with muscle damage or performance very well, it just seems like a very, very weak predictor of recovery at all. And so I don't even really try and triangulate it much. Like, yeah, if you're incredibly sore to the point that you can barely walk, and when you try and train in the gym, you can perform like shit, maybe that's something to worry about, right? Like, certainly at that point. But equally, I said you perform poorly, you know? Like, oftentimes you can be pretty sore, and then when you get to the gym, you perform just fine. Likewise, I don't think we have really any strong evidence suggesting that soreness, one, is related to muscle damage, and two, muscle damage is clearly like always a good thing for hypertrophy, and we know exactly that relationship. In fact, we have an article going very in depth on the stimuli and mechanisms of hypertrophy coming out in the next couple months that you'll be able to check out. But when it comes to how weekly soreness predicts muscle damage, and then how many question marks remain between muscle damage and hypertrophy, there's just too many leaps of faith for me to tell you this is a good thing. That's how I feel about it. So,
awesome.
Yeah. Nick Josipovich on Facebook asks, women can tone muscle with light weights and high reps. Past a certain age, you can't grow muscle anymore. Heavy compound lifts will build more muscle since they raise your testosterone levels. Let's take these one by one. There are 3 different statements. We can start with women can tone muscle with light weights and high reps. What do you think?
Yeah. So the idea of toning is an idea that I'm not sure exactly where the word toning started from. It does make some intuitive sense if you have no idea about muscle growth or muscle physiology whatsoever, but you cannot really tone a muscle. You can make a muscle bigger and you can lose fat and sort of show that muscle. So toning usually refers to fat loss and revealing one's muscle definition. But it is sometimes presented as an additional sort of approach to training. So you'll see people claim that, I offer services that will allow you to build muscle, lose fat, and tone as well. And back in the day, people thought that you can sort of manipulate the shape of the muscle and how much you can see it by doing different sort of trainings and by doing higher reps to sort of sculpt it more, but heavy weights make it thicker. A lot of hearsay. Now, the idea that women need to train differently than men is an idea that is not really evidence-based. There are some minor adjustments that one could make as it pertains to volume, but when it comes to proximity to failure, exercise selection, and in general, basic training principles, women should be training almost exactly the same as men without any major differences. The idea that women are, more frail or whatever, and they have to do like super light weights and do the typical pink dumbbell workout is BS, and it's an idea that needs to be sort of abolished. If you are a woman who wants to build an appreciable level of muscle mass, you need to be lifting weights close to failure, doing enough training volume, not fear heavy weights or that you're going to all of a sudden break. Obviously, the absolute loads handled from women will likely be lower to those on average handled by men, but relatively speaking, you should be lifting as heavy. And if you want to lose fat and quote unquote tone, the principle of being in a calorie deficit applies there. Anything you want to add?
No,
Awesome.
I think that's pretty reasonable. I'll hit you up with the next one. Past a certain age, you can't grow muscle anymore.
Yeah, now I think this falls in this sort of nocebo feeling that comes with age, where people think that as you get older, your body goes to absolute shit. Your metabolism massively slows down. It's very difficult to make muscle gains. And, if you haven't done so in your 20s, you have, lost your chance. When in reality, both for muscle growth and strength, if we look at powerlifting data, now keep in mind, I am talking about, people in their 40s to 60s, I guess, you can still build an appreciable level of muscle mass and an appreciable level of muscle strength. Obviously, by that time, there may be more to your lifestyle that makes it a bit more difficult to adhere to higher volumes. And if you're not really conditioned and you haven't been training for a while, it may take a bit more time to get used to things. But there's no reason why you shouldn't build a ton of muscle mass. Do we know for sure that you're going to build the exact amount of muscle mass if you had started 20 years earlier? No, but then you can make the argument that, hey, if you're looking at an individual who's been training for 30 years versus somebody who's been training for 10 years, it does make sense that the person who trained for 30 years may have built a bit more muscle. But your age shouldn't detract you from engaging in resistance training. Even if on paper you are able to build 10% less muscle, you can still get pretty jacked, pretty strong, and reap all the health benefits of resistance training, and this, with your metabolism, for example, because that's something that is mentioned alongside sometimes when we look at long-term data on age and metabolism. Things don't change much. Usually, what happens is as people get older, they move less, they have more stressors in their lives, families, jobs, other commitments. They haven't built the necessary habits to have long-term success with resistance training, and that makes the whole process a bit more tedious and creates this sort of illusion that, oh, when I was younger, I was able to build more muscle mass because physiologically a lot of things were massively different. Obviously, I'm making certain assumptions here that hormonally things are fine and your health is fine, but there's no reason to nocebo yourself and say that you can't grow muscle anymore.
Yeah, pretty much agree. I think people are always very quick to jump to assumptions about their age as well, where it's like, oh, I'm 35. My recovery must have taken a huge hit, and I'm no longer in my 20s and I can no longer build muscle. It's like many of the, especially if you're lifting weights consistently and just being generally physically active, many of the age-related consequences on recovery and muscle loss are essentially null and void until you get much, much older. And even then, it's not as though you can't build muscle anymore. It's just that, as was outlined in a review paper by some authors that I'm forgetting the name of right now that I'll link in the description in 2024, basically as you age, part of the reason for a natural limit is anabolic resistance does rise. But especially if you've not been training for that long, even if you're 60, 70, even 80 plus, if you've not been training very long, you can still build muscle. It just becomes a bit incrementally harder. And if by the time you get to your 50s, say you've been training for 35 years really hard, really consistently, really well, that is going to be more of an obstacle than just your age. Like, your training age probably is a greater barrier to making meaningful gains than your actual age, to a large extent. Obviously, once you get very, very old, that is different, but yeah, I think people overestimate the impact of age on gains generally, and it's a big nocebo.
Yeah, 100%.
Right, last one. Let me tee you up. Heavy compound lifts will build more muscle since they raise your testosterone levels. Classic.
I remember having that argument with a guy back in the old school version of Spartan's gym here in Southampton anyways, a hardcore bodybuilding gym, and a guy was telling us, I'm doing squats because they raise testosterone and growth hormone, and that will grow my upper body. And when sort of rebutted with the literature, they said, hey, I'm a personal trainer, I know better. Which is true, and they did know better, and no, I'm joking. The idea that heavy compound lifts, which are always thought of as free weight compound lifts, will result in the hormone increases that will then result to more muscle mass is not really the case. Although there is some evidence showing that you may get a greater spike in testosterone after performing some compound lifts close to failure. Overall, if you are training close to failure and performing a bunch of lifts, it's not like you're going to be seeing any sort of difference in muscle growth simply because your body's like, oh, you did a squat, let me just release a bunch of hormones and grow your body altogether. This falls back into this sort of you got to get strong to get big, a category where a lot of focus was placed on the free weight barbell lifts because they were presented as game changers because of how much they get the whole body to grow, even if there's no actual physiological rationale for squats growing your biceps and triceps. So heavy compound lifts, whatever that means, will not necessarily build more muscle than, moderate load compound lifts or isolation lifts, obviously depending on the musculature that you're looking at.
Yeah, broadly agree. Generally, and I've reviewed this in an article on stretch-mediated hypertrophy on the website, some literature suggests that certain types of training will cause greater acute elevations in hormones like testosterone, growth hormone, etc., IGF-1 even, And generally, those are things like taking shorter rest times, performing higher volumes of resistance training, as in volume load, like higher reps, higher number of sets, etc. Generally, the larger the amount of muscle mass involved, the greater the elevation. However, these acute, short-lived spikes in hormone levels aren't sufficient to cause any difference in hypertrophy. And there's a good review article by Fink et al. Called The Role of Hormones in Muscle Hypertrophy, where, hey, if all you do is read the abstract, one of the sentences is, acute resistance training-induced hormonal elevations seem not to be directly correlated with muscle growth. So, in general, the idea that short rest times, or big compound lifts, or really anything else is going to drastically increase non-local muscle growth, like as in if you're training your legs, it'll grow your upper body, or vice versa, just doesn't seem to have much research backing whatsoever at this point. And oftentimes the suggestions being made to increase those acute spikes in hormones are directly counterproductive to hypertrophy. Like, for example, taking super short rest times, probably not ideal for hypertrophy, like less than 30 seconds or 30 seconds or what have you. So yeah, just not really any foundation as far as training goes. It's very reductionist view. It's kind of like the thing you mentioned with, I think we talked about tension at some point. Yeah, we talked about getting strong to get big and how that might increase tension because you're able to lift more. This kind of falls in the same category, where it's a very reductionist line of thinking, where it's like hormone-like testosterone, good muscle growth type of thinking, and more tension, good. And it's like, yeah, okay, tension is definitely one of the stimuli for hypertrophy, but it doesn't operate in a vacuum, and there are other ones. So, yeah, just not really anything to it from the literature side of things.
Yeah, the same is observed with like test boosters and stuff, which we covered in a recent video, where sure you may see a slight increase, but that's not enough to actually make any meaningful difference to muscle growth. Cool. That is it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. More episodes coming, cool articles coming, more videos are coming. A lot of stuff is coming, including that infamous hypertrophy mechanisms article that we're finalizing at the moment. So from all of us here, have a great day, great week, and we will see you guys next time.
Peace.
Peace.